CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Live from London, this is Global Business.
Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Paul Barber.
And I'm Robin Dwyer. Our top stories. More than 700 Palestinians killed in Gaza by airstrikes in the last 24 hours as Israel intensifies its bombardment of the besieged enclave.
At this critical hour, I appeal to all to pull back from the brink before the violence claims even more lives and spreads even further.
Secretary General says he's deeply concerned over what he calls clear violations of international humanitarian law in Gaza.
President Macron says France stands with Israel today, tomorrow and the day after, but calls for a decisive relaunch of the Palestinian peace process.
And worries the Eurozone economy could be in recession as a key PMI figure comes in worse than expected.
Plus, lithium mining companies say demand for electric vehicles could spark an economic boom in parts of the UK.
An immediate call for a humanitarian ceasefire. The words from the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
The UN Security Council is meeting to assess the ongoing conflict between Israel and Hamas and the plight of the Palestinians under bombardment in Gaza. The UN's relief agency says they expect 20 more aid trucks to enter through the Rafah crossing today, but say that is a drop in the ocean of what the 1.4 million displaced people in Gaza need. Antonio Guterres condemned the actions of Hamas on October the 7th, but said he was deeply alarmed at the ongoing Israeli airstrikes.
It is important to also recognize the attacks by Hamas did not happen in a vacuum. The Palestinian people have been subjected to 56 years of suffocating occupation. They have seen their land steadily devoured by settlements and plagued by violence, their economy stifled, their people displaced and their homes demolished. Their hopes for a political solution to their plight have been vanishing.
Well, more diplomatic efforts are underway in the Middle East, with France's President Emmanuel Macron the latest to meet Israeli and Palestinian leaders. Meanwhile, China's foreign minister will talk to his American counterparts later this week.
Wang Yi is quoted as saying that international law has to be respected and civilians need to be protected. Our correspondent Yolo Abdavid has the latest on the conflict affecting ordinary people on both sides.
4 of the kidnapped civilians from 2 weeks ago have been released by Hamas. Not many will have experienced what 85-year-old Yocheved Lifshitz experienced. Taken on a motorbike into Gaza, her daughter translates her story.
There they walked for a few kilometers on the wet ground. There are a huge network of tunnels underneath. It looks like a spider web.
There is political focus to avert more bloodshed. Emmanuel Macron arrived in Tel Aviv. His first meeting was with Israeli-French families. And before meeting President of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, he met Israel's President, Isaac Herzog.
This is an awful crime to play with these lives of children, adults, all people, civilians and soldiers.
Meanwhile, aerial bombing of the Gaza Strip goes on. 704 are reported killed in the past 24 hours. The latest footage shows how much parts of Gaza has been devastated. Makeshift refugee camps are at best inadequate, without basic needs to cater for families.
I use bottled water to try to clean everything. The children's hands, their bodies, at least to get the sand off. I can't even bathe my children. I don't have water. I don't have space to wash them. I can't find clean clothes. I don't have clean floors for them to sit on. I worry about their health. They cough and their nose runs at night. My oldest son has asthma.
The constant threat of airstrikes and the waiting to see if this war intensifies, should Israeli tanks and troops enter the Gaza Strip on the ground, make it harder for the authorities to help ordinary people.
The crowding of civilians and the fact that most schools are now housing a large number of people is the prime breeding ground for disease to spread, like problems with stomach disease, lung infections, skin rashes, and this is what we've seen in most of the patients coming into this hospital for treatment.
As diplomats and leaders shuffle between both sides to encourage a temporary ceasefire at least, Israel's reservists are still camped on the Gaza border.
We have long weeks of fighting ahead of us, and we will act at the most suitable operational timing and according to political instructions.
The focus in the past 2 weeks have been mostly on the suffering in Gaza, and in Israel on the deaths of 1,400 Israelis and the more than 200 hostages. But there's deep concern that protests in the West Bank and military incursions by Hezbollah in Lebanon could trigger a much wider conflict.
So, Yolo, how are Antonio Guterres' comments being received?
I think it's quite striking that so many people turned up for this open debate in the Security Council. There were a dozen foreign ministers there. A lot of people wanted to talk. Feelings are running so high. And because of Guterres' comments, especially when he said that Palestinians have seen their land steadily being devoured by settlements, plagued by violence, their economy stifled, people displaced, is the way that he said that after saying what had happened to Israelis 2 weeks ago, which of course was inexcusable, that it was the strength of what he said and how he said it. Immediately, the Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen said that this criticism of Israel's policies and what it hopes to conduct in Gaza was in what country, in what world do you live in? He asked the Secretary General, and he said that his comments and his speech was shocking. And I think that shows and reflects almost a new front politically and diplomatically, especially with Mr. Guterres, because he's been to Gaza, he knows that UNRWA staff, UN staff in Gaza have been killed, and of course he was on that border trying to open up the Rafah crossing. So I think these comments will be publicised all over the world.
And Yolo, the flurry of diplomacy continues. President Macron of France in Israel speaking to the Israelis and also to the Palestinians.
Yes, and quite striking again that Monsieur Macron, when he arrived in France, in Israel, he spoke immediately to Israeli French, people who have relatives who had been killed. Then he met Isaac Herzog and Benjamin Netanyahu, the leaders of Israel, as you would expect, as most leaders have. But he went further. He went to Ramallah. He went to the West Bank to meet President Mahmoud Abbas, because Abbas is the only person that the majority of the Western world, at least, thinks is the voice of the Palestinian Authority. He leads the Palestinian Authority, and in a way, none of them feel confident that they can talk to Hamas or Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad or anybody else because they're designated terrorist groups. So to go and make sure that he takes his photo and has a speech and a conversation with Abbas, as he did with Netanyahu, despite quite strong comments. He did say in Tel Aviv with Mr. Netanyahu, he also wanted to be seen with Mr. Abbas.
And Yolo, we had an extraordinary moment today, didn't we, when Hamas released 2 more hostages. One of them shook her captor's hand, and we've heard from her today.
Unbelievable comments and quite an unbelievable press conference in Israel. But actually, the pictures released by Hamas, the pictures that show as she's been taken in the dark to an ambulance to bring her into Israel to see her family again, she turns around and she shakes the hand of one Hamas gunman who stands behind her and says, "Shalom, peace." And when she actually came to face this barrage of cameras and microphones, and the detail, her recollection as an 85-year-old woman who had such a trauma, and she remembers walking in this spider nest of tunnels underground. The air was moist, the earth was moist. She remembers being with 25 other hostages. Remarkable account of what she saw, and I'm sure that quite a lot of people in Israel and outside will really listen and look at what she said.
Yolo, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Yolo Abdavid. Our correspondent in southern Gaza, Noor Harazin, says the situation at hospitals there is indescribable.
Around 3 hours ago, the Palestinian Health Ministry said in a statement that the number of Palestinians killed in the past 3 weeks is 5,791, including 2,360 children. But I can tell you by standing here that the number has exceeded at least 5,800. The situation, it's a chaos here at the Shuhada Al-Aqsa Hospital, which is located in southern Gaza in Deir al-Balah city. And actually, most of the people who were killed during Israeli strikes in the past hours here in Deir al-Balah are people from Gaza City, people who fled their homes from northern Gaza and from central Gaza City and came here to take shelter at either relatives' homes, hospitals, schools. This is the situation from my side now.
And that was Noor Harazin reporting from southern Gaza. Well, with the view from Israel, our correspondent Zhozha Shin is in Tel Aviv.
Well, we know that there is multiple diplomatic efforts going on, as we heard from the time of Israel citing a senior diplomat saying that Israel and Hamas are now in an advanced negotiation through Egypt and Qatar to release 50 more hostages in the package. We know that this morning 2 Israeli women were brought to Tel Aviv for further medical observation. According to the 55-year Lifjits, the Hamas took the captive through a underground network to an area that where they have those daily necessities, for example, like a shampoo and a conditioner, and also her injured husband actually was given antibiotics by the paramedics, and he also she also carried a really important message to the public that Hamas prepared this and issued warnings of the attacks some 3 weeks ago. And she also, from the previous video, we also saw Lifjits shake hands with the Hamas militias before, after being released. In Hebrew, said Shalom, which means goodbye and peace. And that also has been calling on, we see the protest in the downtown Tel Aviv calling on the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to expand efforts in negotiations. And this is also we see this kind of things, efforts being made. But of course, we understand, this is the second pair. We expect more, but still this is the kind of knack between, different parties, and they will just try to weigh in these negotiations, try to save more. As we see now, we have about 200 hostages still being held in Gaza by Hamas, and also reports say that there might be about 22 being killed in either, we cannot identify the Israeli airstrikes or the Hamas airstrikes. As we speak, actually, we just heard several interceptions conducted above our head. This is not kind of like the negotiations atmosphere. We know that the two sides are still exchanging fires, but we still have no idea the timing of the offensive, the ground offensive, as we are now talking about. But we also see that the Israeli side are showing its willingness to delay this offensive.
Yossi Meckelberg is Associate Fellow for the Middle East and North Africa at the think tank Chatham House. I asked him what the release of those 2 further hostages could mean for the conflict.
This is the interesting thing, because on the one hand, everyone expects an Israeli military incursion, but at the same time we see some moves to release hostages, and maybe this is part of Hamas' delay tactics. The more there is expectation for hostages to be released, the more there is a chance of a delay. Then they can regroup, or even make the pressure on Israel not even to conduct military incursion, the ground offensive. But bear in mind, there are around 220 hostages at the release of 2 every day. If this is the rate, it means we are at the rate that will take 3 months or more to release all of them. So this is part of the type of communication between Israel, Hamas, but also external forces, powers, whether it's the United States, Europe, Qatar, to try to see how to diffuse the situation, knowing that the possibility of a ground offensive is very likely.
So, given all that, do you think a ground offensive will now happen? Will it happen in the way that people initially thought it would?
Well, that's the thing. I believe that the likelihood of a ground offensive is high. At the same time, probably different what we probably thought about it had it taken place 2 weeks ago. It might be more surgical that we expected. It might also, there is no doubt that the anger in the first few days, the call for revenge were so strong that it might have affected, or it was bound to affect, those who take decision. 2 weeks later, there is more understanding, also more pressures from other actors, either regional or beyond the region, the United States and Europe, that need to think about any military operation, also in terms of political objectives, not just about punishing Hamas.
So you were talking there about the regional, international actors taking part in this. Do you think a ground offensive will make a spread of this conflict inevitable?
First of all, we need to understand that any military operation of this sort, even if it's a limited, will actually end with more casualties on both sides, but also of many civilians. We already seen it over the last 2 weeks. And the count of Palestinians killed is more probably around of 5,000, and any further operations will increase that. This will agitate the region among many countries. So this has to be taken into account. It can have a destabilizing impact on the region. Now, there is always the possibility, the worst thing getting Gaza, that then the Hezbollah, under the influence of Iran, might decide to join in from Lebanon, maybe from Syria, and then we enter into the new dynamic within the region. Last week, we witnessed a missile and drones launched from Yemen towards Israel. So yes, we are in a very dangerous, very volatile stage of this conflict.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead. Iceland's Prime Minister goes on strike as part of a nationwide walkout calling for equal rights for women.
Ever wondered what's the difference between a bear and a bull market? Where are the cash cows? And who are the lame ducks? And what exactly are black swans? Grey rhinos? And unicorn companies? Make sense of it all with Global Business, only on CGTN.
I think it should be more global cooperation.
I would like to hear more the voice of the developing countries.
Globalization has lifted more than 1 billion people out of poverty.
The green transition has to happen. It's a necessity.
For China and the United States are important powers in the world.
What unites us is much more than what divides us. And I believe China is committed to this agenda.
Join me, Juliet Mann, to set the agenda at these times every weekend on CGTN.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
One more offensive in a long line of battles that's been ongoing for more.
Just got to be careful here with some gunshots. Excuse us.
The world today matters for your world tomorrow.
The number of casualties is growing quickly.
Why, this is one of the hardest hit towns in the region.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
Join us in San Francisco on November 14th through 16th for the most influential meeting of the world's leaders and business executives in the Asia Pacific. The APEC CEO Summit 2023 will focus on creating economic opportunity. The summit will promote sustainability, inclusion, resilience, and innovation across the Asia Pacific. Don't miss your chance to be part of the conversation. Request your invitation at apecceosummit2023.com.
Hello, welcome back. Business activity in Germany has fallen for the fourth straight month in October, raising fears that the Eurozone's biggest economy has entered a recession. The Purchasing Managers' Index is down to 46.5, worse than economists had been expecting. Well, let's talk to our correspondent, Trent Murray in Berlin. So, Trent, this set of figures shows both manufacturing and the service sector seem to be suffering. Which is significant?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, two incredible bedrock parts of not just the German economy, really, but the Eurozone economy more broadly. And that's why we always eagerly await these PMI numbers, because they are a really good indicator of the overall economic picture, but also the strength of private sector activity. And what we are seeing across both manufacturing and services is that things are heading downward. I want to break down some numbers for you, if I could, Robin. The number that we're looking for here is 50 or anything above. That gives an indication of things growing. Yet, in manufacturing, today's figures show manufacturing's PMI hit 43. So again, well below 50, showing things are falling down from 43.4 last month. Now, over on the services sector, well, things sank to a 32-month low. Again, down to 47.8, well below that 50 threshold. So what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that demand is softening, that those purchasing managers which complete this really influential survey monthly are not optimistic around future orders, and it paints a worrying picture, I think it should be said, for both politicians but also banking regulators, central bank figures like Christine Lagarde, who right now are trying to make some decisions around whether to raise interest rates yet again in order to try and tame inflation.
So a worrying picture, a gloomy picture, and what everyone is worried about is the possibility of a wide recession across the Eurozone.
Yeah, well, in the Eurozone, things are moving from bad to worse. Now, those are not my words. Those are the words of the chief economist at the Hamburg Commercial Bank, one of the country's most influential banks here. Cyrus de la Ribia is saying today that he and many in the industry wouldn't be caught off guard if they were to see a mild recession in the Eurozone. In other words, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth this year, or not off the back of these figures, because essentially what we are seeing, as I say, is that slump in demand. Interestingly, when we've had recessions in the past, they quite often have stemmed from southern parts of Europe. But what is interesting about these figures is that it's the Eurozone's 2 largest economies, here where I am in Germany, but also in neighbouring France. Those 2 countries really dragging the chain, if you will. And if we are to see a recession, then many economists say it will be because of economic activity in the 2 largest economies here, in many ways almost flipping the equation from what we've seen in recent decades when things have turned ugly economically across the Eurozone.
And this could all feed into what happens next with interest rates, and the European Central Bank is meeting to talk about those this week.
Yeah, all eyes on that meeting. That's actually taking place in Athens, of all places. Christine Lagarde will get the governors there and central bank figures from across Europe to decide whether to halt what has been really the most aggressive series of interest rate rises in history. We've had, Eurozone inflation is still running at double what the mandated target is. And yet I think all of these numbers that we're seeing, as well as the situation in the Middle East unfolding across markets and making investors jittery, the expectation is that the ECB may just hit the brakes on these interest rate rises because, of course, while they do want to try and tame that red-hot inflation across the bloc, what they don't want to do is to put so much pressure on that it tips the 27-member bloc of the Eurozone into a recession. Whether they can stop that or not now, we'll have to see, given that many economists are already saying the Eurozone will probably fall into recession this year, but it will make for some very, very interesting reading when the minutes from that meeting come out later this week. Robin.
Trent, thank you very much. Our correspondent Trent Murray in Berlin.
General Motors says it's losing $200 million a week in lost vehicle production due to a sweeping auto workers' strike. But it still managed to rake in $44 billion in revenue during the third quarter, which was better than expected. Let's get more on this now with our correspondent in New York, John Territz. So, John, $44 billion, that ain't half bad, is it?
No. I mean, that would buy you a few holidays, wouldn't it, in the Caribbean? I think so, one way and another. Look, GM and Ford later this week are in a very difficult position because if their earnings are too good, and they probably are, actually, then the unions will be on their case. And if they weren't quite good enough, then Wall Street would have been on their case. So they're sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place, really. In the end, this latest set of figures beat Wall Street expectations really quite significantly. The CFO says they're losing $200 million a week because of the strike. He says they've lost $800 million since the 15th of September when it started, and $200 million of that is reflected in these latest figures. So just to give you an idea of what they made, $2.28 in the earnings, not $1.88. That's quite a difference. And the revenue, $44 billion, as you said, Paul, not $43 billion, as had been anticipated. However, it's not all great, because the strike has meant that they've pulled their guidance for the whole of 2023. These companies always tell us what they think they'll make per quarter and what they think they'll make for the whole year. And GM was saying, we think we're going to make about 12 to 14 billion in the course of the whole of 2023. And they've pulled that now. It's off the table. So we simply don't know. And that is because of the strike. And also, they have rowed back from their targets for electric vehicle making. And that is partly because of the strike and partly because of a downturn in demand, which we actually saw last week, if you remember, when Tesla gave us their earnings. Now, the enemy was on their back immediately, the UAW, Sean Fain, the boss, bam, straight in there. Within minutes of these figures coming out, he's pulled 5,000 workers out of a General Motors factory in Arlington. It's called the Arlington Assembly Plant in Texas. They make SUVs. So he really hit them where it hurts there. And of course, the union is really pushing for more money. Now, the big companies are offering about 23% at the moment, give or take. The unions originally wanted 40. I think they've rowed back from that, but nonetheless, they're pushing for more, saying, well, look, you know, even in the middle of a strike, you managed to make all this money. Now, the Ford Motor Company will give us its earnings on Thursday after the closing bell, so it will be after our time on this program. And, of course, I was on the program only yesterday telling you how the unions had increased their action at a Stellantis plant. That was yesterday. And that was the first time they've done anything at Stellantis for a month and the first time that they had increased their action for 2 weeks. But that was yesterday. So we had yesterday, and now we have the one down in Texas being added. So what are the markets doing? Well, right now, let me tell you about the share prices, first of all. Understandably, they're down. GM down 0.25%, Ford down 1/5 of 1%, Stellantis down 1.2%. They're always down more than the others. I'm never sure why that is. Maybe because they're overseas owned. Anyway, at the moment, the markets are sharply up. We've got the Dow up by more than 200 points and the S&P 500 ahead by 27. And that is because the yield on the 2- and the 10-year Treasury notes has stabilized. Now, I know that's a bit wonky and it's kind of difficult to understand, really, but basically that's the reason we've got quite a strong rally going on here at the moment, but not with the car companies, as I just said.
OK, John, and aside from the auto industry, it's a really busy week for earnings, isn't it? What are your highlights?
1/3 of the S&P 500 are giving us their earnings this week. I mean, I'm swamped, quite frankly, and I've picked a handful. Actually, these are the companies, the big ones anyway, that gave us their earnings this morning. So how about 3M? 3M is based in the hardscrabble Midwest in Minnesota. They make, among other things, Post-it notes, those yellow things that you stick on your colleagues' desks. They also make fiber optics. They beat Wall Street expectations. They boosted their outlook, and that despite a multi-billion-dollar charge that they have to take in this quarter for basically selling faulty ear defenders to the U.S. military for years and years and years. They knew about it, and they still went on. Anyway, 3M shares up 4%. Coca-Cola up 3%. They basically beat expectations, and they raised their prices, just like Pepsi. People quite happy to spend more on Pepsi and Coca-Cola. GE, which used to to be on the Dow, but isn't anymore, up 6% at the moment. They've split into three divisions: healthcare, climate issues and aviation. They beat expectations because of increased demand for jet engines. Spotify up 10%. The streamer making deep cuts in the way it does things, and that pleased Wall Street. Now, tonight, after the closing bell, in about 3 hours' time, we hear from Alphabet, which is Google, Microsoft and Snap Inc. So with Alphabet, it'll all be about advertising. Microsoft is a leader in AI, less so in PCs these days, more in AI, with their partners OpenAI and ChatGPT. And Snap Inc., of course, has to compete with the behemoth that is TikTok these days. So there we are. That's where we're at the moment. We look forward to those earnings coming out. And the point about the big tech earnings this week, just so you know, is will they be good enough to give us a lift into the end of the year? That's what people are hoping, particularly from the big 7 tech stocks, of which there are 2 of them reporting in a few hours' time. And just one quick note, Bitcoin is now above 34,000, and not bad when it was down around 20,000 a couple of months ago. Back to you.
OK, great summary. Thank you very much for that, John. John Terretts in New York.
The world's largest sovereign wealth fund has lost $34 billion in its third quarter. The Norway fund sustained heavy falls in the value of bonds and equities, which account for more than 70% of its value. Its return on investment was more than -2% between July and September.
China's Great Wall Motors has become the first electric vehicle maker to respond to a European Union anti-subsidy probe. Company CEO Mu Feng said a fair and open trade environment is needed. He says the automaker has big plans for the European region, which is one of the key markets for Great Wall. Other car makers, including Tesla, BMW and Polestar, are also under scrutiny.
Barclays is set to announce another round of cost-cutting after a steep fall in third-quarter profits. Britain's second-largest bank made $2.3 billion in the 3 months to the end of September, which was more than analysts had expected. But the results are down 4% overall on this time last year, as the group continues to lose ground in its core UK retail market.
The UK employment rate rose to 4.2% between June and August. That's up from 4% in the March to May quarter. The rise is fueling expectations that the Bank of England will leave interest rates on hold again when it meets in November. The UK's central bank left the benchmark rate unchanged at 5.25% in September, ending a run of 14 consecutive rises.
Sales at French luxury goods group Hermès rose in the third quarter amid strong sales in core European and US markets. The group, which is best known for its top-end handbags and scarves, saw a 15% rise in sales in the 3 months to the end of September, but the figure was down on the previous quarter. Tens of thousands of women across Iceland, including the Prime Minister, are staging a 24-hour strike over gender inequality. Prime Minister Jakobsdóttir said the fight for equal treatment was moving too slowly. It's the first all-women strike held in the country for nearly 50 years. Let's talk now to Rosa Björk Brynjolfsdóttir, who's a former Member of Parliament of Iceland. Welcome to the programme. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
You've got the Prime Minister, amongst others, stopping work. How much of an impact will this strike cause?
I mean, this is the first, as you mentioned in your foreword, this is the first women strikes in 48 years in Iceland. Women in Iceland did that on the same day in 1975. And actually, we're still today. It's amazing to see all the women and non-binary people gathering out in the streets of Reykjavik, the capital. Fortunately, we have a great weather in Reykjavik and in Iceland, so it's really plentiful of joy and unity, and a lot of people gathering, or women gathering in the streets of Reykjavik. So that's just wonderful to see all this unity where women are demanding gender justice. And of course, the businesses has already, and of course, schools and health institution has, of course, felt the impact of women strikes today in Iceland. And that's just revealing the necessity of women who, as a great part of the women, the working force in Iceland.
So you mentioned the previous all-women strike in Iceland 48 years ago. That one did make a difference, didn't it? Can this one?
Well, let's hope so. That's actually the demand of the women who are going on a strike today. We are still faced with gender-based violence, which is a major concern in our country, and domestic violence. And women's income is still 21% lower than the income of men. So that is injustice that has to be turned around. But the strike in 1975 that had a major input, we elected women as the first woman who was a leader of a democratic republic country a few years later, in 1981, when we elected Madame Vigdis Finnbogadóttir as the president of Iceland. And we also saw in the aftermath of the last strike, 48 years ago, we saw a creation of a feminist political party that actually put the number of elected members, or women as elected members, up. So that had a major impact on the political life and situation of women in Iceland at the time.
You could say, though, that all the other countries in the world would be looking at Iceland with envy, because it's actually been ranked the best country in the world for gender equality by the World Economic Forum for 14 years in a row. So it must be doing something right.
Yes, we are doing something right. We have, for example, now a woman who is the prime minister. She's been prime minister since 2016. We have 6 ministers who are women out of 12. So half of our ministers are women. We have 47.6% of the members of the parliament are women. We have a very huge part of the working force are women, as we can witness today when they're going on strike. But still, as I mentioned, we are still paid less than men. We are faced with gender-based violence, and the justice system is not that good. So we have been fighting for improvement in the justice system. So even us in Iceland, we have a very good situation when it comes to gender equality. We still have a lot of things to fight for. And the Me Too movement in 2017 revealed misogyny in every aspect of our society as elsewhere in the world.
Rosa, good to talk to you. Thank you for joining us today. That's Rosa Björk Brynjolfsdóttir, the former Member of Parliament of Iceland.
You're watching CGTN, still ahead. 3 months after its election, Spain may finally have a new coalition government if Parliament can agree on the deal.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
What do we mean when we talk about the difference?
Brazen axe.
The difference is in the detail, the background,
Defense ministers from
the wider angle and perspective of every story. Wherever the story may be. CGTN. See the difference.
We are all connected. Across borders, across continents, connected by ideas, a shared humanity. Stay connected.
Welcome back to Global Business Europe with Robin Dwyer and Paul Barber. The headlines again. More than 700 Palestinians killed in Gaza by airstrikes in the last 24 hours as Israel intensifies its bombardment of the besieged enclave.
President Macron says France stands with Israel today, tomorrow and the day after, but calls for a decisive relaunch of the Palestinian peace process.
And worries the Eurozone economy could be in recession as a key PMI figure comes in worse than expected.
Now, demand for fossil fuels will peak by the end of the decade. That's according to the latest reports by the International Energy Agency.
In its annual World Energy Outlook, the watchdog predicts renewables like solar and hydropower will provide half of the world's electricity by 2030. But despite what it calls an unstoppable shift towards the use of clean energy, the IEA warns that fossil fuel emissions are still too high to prevent world temperatures rising above the key threshold of 1.5 degrees Celsius by 2027.
And the IEA says there will be an estimated 220 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030, 10 times as many as last year.
The World Energy Outlook forecasts EVs will have a global market share of 38% of new sales by 2030. But to power those vehicles requires lots more lithium batteries. Our correspondent Paul Hawkins is following the story. Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Robin. Lithium, the world's lightest metal with a high charge density, which makes it perfect for batteries in your phone or laptop. And electric vehicles, demand for which is soaring across the world is race to reach net zero.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Paul. We're having some problems hearing you. We will come back to you in a moment and hear the latest on those lithium batteries.
The Trelava pit. Formerly a China clay mine, it's now one of Europe's frontiers in what some are calling the white gold rush. After 3 years of drilling, Cornish Lithium say the site is commercially viable.
This is a traditional mining operation where they're extracting mineral from rock, and at the moment they're drilling down about 120 metres on average and taking out samples of quartz, laying them in piles, and then the geologists will come along and they'll take samples of these piles of quartz to see how much lithium is inside them.
Yeah. The company says this mine will be fully operational by 2026 and will last 20 years.
In the Trelava project, which is our hard rock project, that'll produce around 10,000 tonnes of lithium carbonate equivalent a year, so the number is something like around 200,000 cars. That would be roughly about 10% or a bit more than the UK will require by 2030.
We're now going to see a much newer type of mining where they extract the mineral directly from the water. It's pioneering technology. They're in the exploration phase and they're trying to work out how much there is in the ground. They think there's a lot, but they're trying to work out how much there is and whether it's commercially viable.
The problem with getting lithium out of rock is it takes a lot of energy. Getting it out of water, on the other hand, from deep underground is easier and greener.
And what we've got is the granite and then the sort of sediments on top. So what we do is we drill down into these structures and then we can pump up the structures back to surface to our plant.
Lithium was first discovered in Cornwall back in 1864, but back then no one had any use for it.
So we've drilled down to about 1.8 kilometres, and what we have now is a team of geologists who are installing a packer system, which is essentially a big balloon, to isolate the structures that we saw in the drill core and then test them by pumping that water to surface. Mining is almost the wrong term for it. It's water
I was going to say, can you call it mining? It's more like water extraction.
Yeah, water extraction, mineral extraction.
From our geothermal water side, that could be significantly more. And yet we don't yet know. We're in the relatively early stages, but every single drill hole we've drilled so far has been successful, and we're really, really excited about the potential there.
The last mine closed in 1998, leaving the county reliant on seasonal tourism. It's now one of the most economically and socially deprived areas in Europe.
I'm positive. I feel positive about it.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, great.
We need to use what's here.
it should be coming back because there's so much of the mines that have still got stuff in that.
It'll bring a lot of investment, a lot of jobs, a lot of money.
I happen to disagree, to be honest.
Really?
Yeah, on account of its effect on natural beauty and its effect on the environment.
Our Trelava project is an existing open pit or quarry. The damage to that has been done long ago. We're going to be very careful about how we mine that project. Our geothermal waters lithium projects are, you wouldn't see very little at all on surface. It's a borehole, it's high tech, but you wouldn't see much.
There's a Cornish word that sums up our race to net zero: directly. It means the task will be completed, but it's unlikely to be in the immediate future. Paul Hawkins, CGTN, Cornwall. There you go. So that's what we discovered in Cornwall. Ironically, the lithium in the battery pack of my microphone failed just as we were talking into that piece, the irony of it. But let's just tell you a little bit more about lithium. It's the world's lightest metal. It's got a very high charge density, makes it perfect for the batteries in your phone or laptop or your microphone, and electric vehicles, demand for which is soaring across the world as countries race to reach net zero. Now, in 2010, batteries made up roughly 20% of the lithium market. By 2021, that had soared to 74%. And that figure is heading up because the size of the global EV market will double over the next 5 years to $907 billion. And with each EV needing around 7 kilograms of lithium, projected demand is expected to reach 1.5 million tonnes by 2025 and over 3 million tonnes by 2030. However, current projections show that production needs to triple by 2025 and increase nearly sixfold by 2030 to keep up. So the race is on to find new sources of lithium, as we've just been seeing. At the moment, Australia and Chile produce 70% of the world's lithium from rock and water, respectively. Europe makes none at the moment. New projects are coming online within the next 5 years in France, Germany, and here in the UK, where 3 companies are mining lithium in a place, as you've just been seeing, called Cornwall, and one of them is called Cornish Lithium. And as you've just been seeing, it's extracting the metal in 2 ways: from the hot spring water deep underground and from the rock. But as we explained, Robin and Paul, there are challenges ahead.
Paul, thank you very much. Our correspondent, Paul Hawkins. 7 people have died after a so-called super fog caused a mass pileup on a US highway. Authorities say nearly 160 vehicles were involved in the accident near New Orleans. The super fog formed after smoke from marsh fires combined with dense mist in the area. Emergency workers spent most of Monday night searching for victims. At least 25 people were taken to hospital.
The inquest into New Zealand's worst mass shooting has opened in Christchurch. 51 people were killed when a white supremacist opened fire at 2 mosques in the city in 2019. The 6-week inquiry will look at 10 issues, including if the gunman had help from any other person and the response by emergency services. The findings are expected to be released next year.
1 person has been killed after 2 cargo ships collided in the North Sea. Germany's Maritime Emergency Authority says the accident happened 20 kilometres from the Heligoland Islands. One of the ships sank. Search teams have rescued 2 crew members, while 4 others are missing. The second ship is still afloat, with 22 people on board. In Spain, Pedro Sanchez's Socialist Party has reached an agreement to form a new government with the country's hard-left Sumar party. The deal comes after an inconclusive election 3 months ago resulted in a hung parliament. Our correspondent Ken Brown reports from Madrid.
I think a lot of people did a double take today when they saw the headlines that a coalition agreement had been reached, thinking, oh, finally, 93 days after the election, we finally have a government here in Spain. But that's not really the case. What we saw today was an agreement between the Socialist PSOE party and the hard-left platform Sumar on a roadmap moving forward if a coalition government can be reached or can be achieved. Now, that really depends on the Catalan separatist party, Junts, and their leader, Carles Puigdemont, who's been in exile since 2017 after the illegal Catalan independence referendum. Now, their price for supporting this coalition would be, at very least, an amnesty for Puigdemont so that he could return to Spain. Now, there is also talk that they may also want some framework for a future legal independence referendum. Sanchez has already red flagged flagged that one. He says he will only negotiate within the constitution. So those negotiations carry on. We do not have a government yet in Spain, and Sanchez has until the 27th of November to form that government. If he doesn't manage to do that, we'll go back to elections in January. That would be Spain's 6th general elections in 9 years. But Sanchez did sound confident today. We heard him say that we've been in power for 5 years and we will be for 4 more.
Ken Brown in Madrid. Leaders of Poland's three-way opposition alliance say they're ready to take power. If successful, the coalition will be headed by former European Council President Donald Tusk, who has served once before as Prime Minister. President Andrzej Duda began talks with party leaders on Tuesday, more than a week after the ruling Conservative PIS lost its majority. Under Poland's constitution, the president names a candidate prime minister who then forms a cabinet that is put to a confidence vote.
You're watching Global Business Europe. Still to come. Another country bans Japanese seafood months after the controversial release of water from the Fukushima nuclear plant.
Events have consequences. Words create impact.
Unprecedented scenes that we saw.
The clean-up operation is now well and truly underway.
Parts of southern Europe remain in a state of emergency.
Context gives meaning. People make history.
Far more than 1,000 people have come here today.
But authorities are still on high alert.
So into the attention of world leaders.
A complex world demands a comprehensive view.
But with the cleanup efforts more or less under control,
the economic impact is bound to ripple across the country.
There's plastic pollution everywhere.
Because the world today matters for your world tomorrow.
This is the liver area of the crew.
And in these mountains, they recently finished building a power plant.
Well, this is something completely different.
The world today, every day on CGTN.
And welcome back. Russia has joined China in a ban on Japanese seafood 2 months after the controversial release of treated wastewater from the Fukushima nuclear plant.
Japan says the move is extremely regrettable. Our correspondent Dasha Chernyshova reports from Moscow.
Moscow says the temporary restrictions on Japanese fish and seafood import are a precautionary measure until Tokyo provides comprehensive evidence that its products are safe. Russian experts say there are no immediate risks to consumers, but there is no way to guarantee the safety of Japanese seafood consumed over the long term.
Fish migrates. It comes from Japan, then comes to us. There will be tritium in it, and so its consumption can affect a person. But for this, it needs to be consumed constantly. If so, there will be an increase in oncological diseases, mutation processes. There's a risk in that. Moreover, the Japanese assure everyone that there are minimum doses of tritium, but they do not allow independent experts in and do not try to carry out cleaning with more expensive new methods.
Experts say the tritium levels should be checked independently, and they are calling on Japan to be open for further testing. Russia does not import enough Japanese seafood for Russian consumers to notice the difference on the market, according to industry experts.
We will not feel, will not see, will not sense these changes, but I hope that over time relations will improve and Japan will show great loyalty to the world community and really prove that the discharges made are largely safe. All restrictions will be lifted and we will live in peace and harmony within the framework of ordinary economic policy.
Despite Japan's objections, there are still international concerns over the long-term impact of releasing even treated discharge from the Fukushima nuclear power plant. Still, Russia's decision is widely seen as a political move, a response that intends to underline the unacceptability of Japan's decision and the need for more independent testing. Tokyo insists Russian decision is not rooted in science, but Moscow says it wants more information. The ban comes after 2 months of consultations with Tokyo and against the backdrop of regional and international tension. Dasha Chernysova, CGTN, Moscow.
Brazil is one of the world's biggest economies, due mainly to foreign investment and exports. The country has ambitious growth plans, but not the infrastructure needed to make them happen.
So now the Brazilian government is looking for international investors to help change that, including China. Our correspondent Paulo Cabral reports.
This region in Brazil's heartland, an area known as Mato Piba, is a fast-growing farming district, but it still lacks infrastructure to fully realize its potential. Logistics is one of the big shortcomings. Hopes are a 1,500-kilometer railway project, now in the early construction stages, may help the region. It's part of Brazil's growth acceleration program, known as PAC, an ambitious $350 billion investment plan to revamp the country's infrastructure while boosting the economy.
We can source locally resources here, which help us to develop. For instance, we have a small business here, which has improved a lot after we enter into this project here, because they were very small and now they are at least a medium enterprise.
This stretch of railway is currently under construction by the engineering division of the Brazilian Army. However, the government's plan is to engage local and international private partners, both investors and contractors, for infrastructure projects linked to the growth acceleration program all over the country. There's already in the region a rather large solar energy park, which is now being expanded with private investment. Current energy sources are limited, and high insulation could be an important part of the solution. There is also a project to duplicate the road connecting the two main cities in the area, Barreiras and Luiz Eduardo Magalhães, and an investment plan for the local airport, which has seen increasing demand over the last few years with a growing flow of business people into the area.
The runway will be extended by 700 meters, and the maneuvering apron will also significantly increase. It will be 3 times the size it is today. The construction is very important for our Western Bahia. With this project, we will be able to bring in larger flights, including jet aircraft.
Our region really needs these projects, and the production of our region is very important for the whole of the state of Bahia and of Brazil. Because it's so important, I really trust these projects will be executed.
In recent months, Brazil's government has organized meetings with foreign officials and investors to make presentations like this one to Chinese companies and diplomats.
We hope the growth acceleration program will be a way to get us closer to other countries and to international investors. And this is something we really want to happen regarding China.
There is a lot of anticipation for this region, but also concern about potential damage that any infrastructure growth could have on the environment. Paulo Cabral, CGTN, Barreiras, Brazil.
The headlines again. More than 700 Palestinians killed in Gaza by airstrikes in the last 24 hours as Israel intensifies its bombardment of the besieged enclave.
President Macron says France stands with Israel today, tomorrow and the day after, but calls for a decisive relaunch of the Palestinian peace process.
And worries the Eurozone economy could be in recession as a key PMI figure comes in worse than expected.
And that's it for Global Business Europe. Thank you for watching.
Coming up next on CGTN, it's Africa Live. We'll see you again tomorrow. Same time, same place. From all of the team here in London, it's goodbye.
Bye-bye.